Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you also to SMMT for this invitation to address the SMMT Electrified event. And I have to confess that although I am IPCC, I do have a bit of history with the vehicle industry on this topic, because nearly 25 years ago now, I acted as launch director for the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership, now transformed into the ZEMO Partnership. And it was there when I first met Mike Hawes, for example, and also Constanza Scharing, from SMT, who I've just made contact with again. Now, I can still recall in these days getting regular calls from 10 Downing Street asking how the Hydrogen Vehicle Partnership was going. And we'd patiently explain to them that it wasn't the Hydrogen Vehicle Partnership, it was the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership. And time has demonstrated, I think, the risk of hype cycles and the importance of a very clear-sighted perspective on technology options. But this time round, I think it's very clear, the trend is obvious, electrification is the dominant story in terms of emerging technology in the transport sector. Now, after 25 years later, I now have a very different job as chair of IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The job there is to provide advice to the UN system and to policymakers in general concerning climate change and options for climate action, which covers both reducing emissions and adaptation. Now, the I in IPCC is critical. We're an intergovernmental body, though the bulk of the work is actually done by volunteer scientists. And part of my job involves chairing sessions of 100+ country delegations, as I will be doing in Bangkok in 2 weeks' time, and taking on the job of steering them towards consensus. Now, just to emphasize also, IPCC doesn't actually do research. We assess evidence that's already out there in the public domain and try to establish a level of confidence in the findings that are out there. We're related to, but we're different from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We're not a decision-making body, and we are neutral with respect to policy and specific technologies. So we don't engage in advocacy, but we can address the consequences scientifically of adopting specific technologies and exercising policy options. Now, I'm going to run through some of the key findings from the most recent IPCC reports. But let me say right at the start of this, we are a 24/7 organisation, only in a very limited way. We work in assessment cycles that last for 7 years. So that's as far as we get with 24/7. And right now, we are poised between the work of our 6th cycle, which ended in 2023, and the new reports, which will not start to appear until 2028. So I don't have any hot-off-the-press results to bring to you, but let me highlight some of the most important conclusions from the most recent reports. And the big story from the 6th assessment cycle was that a triple strategy in respect of emissions reduction was what mattered. First of all, decarbonise electricity, which is one of the easiest steps to take. Wind and solar are available technologies, and they've experienced huge falls in cost over the last 10 to 15 years. And nuclear power is available as an option for those countries who chose to exercise it. But secondly, if we have zero carbon electricity, if it's available or if it's on the horizon, then it makes sense to electrify the demand side of the energy system to avoid the direct use of fossil fuels. And this applies to heat, of course, but it also especially applies to transport systems, which is the relevance for this meeting. And the third element of the strategy is, of course, the efficient use of energy, which is almost a no-brainer. Now, we had a chapter entirely devoted to transport systems in our last report, and it concluded unambiguously that battery electric vehicles have lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than internal combustion engines when they rely on low carbon electricity. And looking forward in the scenarios, looking forward to low carbon futures, electrification is absolutely the dominant global trend in the transport sector, complemented by the more limited use of some biofuels and hydrogen in specific geographies and contexts. And of course, what I want to emphasize, it's not just about four-wheel vehicles in high-income countries of the kind that are sitting outside the conference center at the moment. The large deployment of electricity vehicles in China, it can actually be hard to even find an internal combustion engine in some Chinese cities when you visit. I've also been quite a frequent visitor to India, and there the electrification of two- and three-wheeled vehicles is proceeding at pace. And electric rickshaws, for example, they're popular with customers because they're cleaner, they're quieter, you can talk to the person you're sitting beside, and from the point of view of the driver, if there's a power cut, which there is very often in parts of India, you can plug the vehicle into the house and actually keep the lights on. So it's a winner for absolutely everybody. And this absolutely illustrates that electrification isn't all about climate change. There are many so-called co-benefits. And a prime example comes from huge air quality benefits in urban areas. And in China, in fact, this is probably the main motivation for moving towards electrification, with carbon dioxide emission reductions, the side benefit. And very topically, and I think it was mentioned in the previous session, there are potential energy security benefits through reduced dependence on fossil fuels. So customers are less exposed to geopolitical risks and volatile energy markets. And for governments, macroeconomic risks are also reduced. On the other hand, we do need to address questions about the availability and the distribution of critical mineral resources. And there are some emerging issues like human rights, for example, in supply chains. Now, there are many opportunities and challenges out there, but in the last report for IPCC, we also talked about the how. How do we actually move forward with electrification and these other trends? And for the first time in IPCC, we had an entire chapter report devoted to demand-side solutions and how they could be fostered. It explored the potential for demand-side solutions and the conditions under which they could be taken up. And the conclusion was that by the middle of this century, global greenhouse gas emissions could be cut by between 40% and 70% using demand-side measures alone. This chapter started out by looking at human needs for mobility, for shelter and nutrition, and identified how these needs could be met with a low carbon footprint. And the strong conclusion, which cuts across sectors but is particularly relevant for transport, is that individual human choice is very important, but it's not the only determining factor, because choice can only be exercised in the context of technology availability and the provision of adequate infrastructure. And the move to electric vehicles absolutely perfectly illustrates this point. Consumers will go electric when they have attractive vehicles, when good ranges are available, and when they're confident that they have access to reliable charging infrastructure. I, for example, spent 5 years as chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission, and there we identified big challenges, especially for people in rural areas and those on lower incomes faced with higher potential upfront costs of electric vehicles. So these are the kind of challenges that are going to need to be addressed. And that brings me to the final element of the how, the role of public policy and the role of government. And financial incentives, which desirably should phase out over time, absolutely have a role to play in increasing the role of electric vehicles. And it would follow the examples of policy interventions for renewable energy, which helped to lower costs through learning by doing and scaling up of the technologies. Now, in previous reports of IPCC, before I came in, there was much more emphasis on the role of pricing in providing consumer incentives. But in the last report, we actually addressed a much wider range of policy instruments, regulations, standardization, sunset clauses for incumbent technologies, information campaigns, etc. And the evidence is, and it's very strong evidence, that these kind of portfolios of measures can be very effective in influencing consumer choice. And the evidence is clear. Although greenhouse gas emissions globally are still continuing to rise, gigatons of emissions have been avoided through proven policies that have been put in place already. And without these policies, emissions would have been even higher. Now, let me just conclude my remarks by highlighting some of the priorities for the current cycle of IPCC, the 7th cycle, and there will indeed be another chapter on transport systems in there. Now, it is manifestly obvious that the world is going to exceed 1.5 degrees of warming within the next few years. Yet 1.5 degrees remains an important marker because it's the level of warming beyond which the risks of climate change, excessive heat, extreme weather, flooding, reduced productivity of agriculture and fisheries, it really starts to accelerate beyond that point. And for that reason, interest has been growing in the long-run prospect of managing so-called temperature overshoot. First, exceeding a given level of warming, then returning to or below that level by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And to be very clear, the first step on that is to reach global net zero emissions. Or let me be very clear that net zero is not a religious icon. Net zero is a physical concept. It's the point at which global warming will stop. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, and therefore stopping global warming involves stopping emissions, and it's that simple. And in our next report, we're going to be paying much more attention to carbon dioxide removal, both land-based, for example, through afforestation or agricultural measures, and through technological approaches, such as direct removal from the atmosphere. But we want to be very clear, that's not an alternative to reducing emissions from existing activities. The accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means that warming does not depend simply on an emission reduction target for a given year. The pathway towards that target does matter. And the longer that emission reductions are postponed, the more carbon dioxide that will accumulate in the atmosphere and the warmer it will get. So with that thought, let me conclude my remarks. A vast portfolio of measures are going to be needed to bring global warming under control, but electrification of energy demand, and specifically electrification in the transport sector, represents one of the most important steps that can be taken. So with that, I'm very pleased to make contact again with the vehicle industry, with Mike and Constanza that are sitting there in the front row. And I wish you strength to your arms in taking this agenda forward. Thank you very much.
Take any questions or not?
I can take them if you want. Yeah.
We've got a couple of minutes. I think we've got a couple of minutes, Sir Jim. That was absolutely fascinating. But if anybody's got a pressing question, I know Sir Jim would be happy to take one or two. And Mike's got one right here. We better take this one, I think, Jim.
Yeah, you have to.
Thanks, Jim. You focused, understandably so, and thankfully, on electrification, decarbonisation of the electricity grid, and so forth, and electrification of surface transport. What we're talking about this morning is the pace of that change, perhaps not meeting expectations. Now, you were formerly on the Committee on Climate Change.
Yeah.
Their recent report says the two things consumers can do most readily is move to an EV and move to heat pumps, basically decarbonising your home.
Yeah.
Can you say a few words about that sort of option? Is that, if we're going to have a gap in terms of carbon budgets because the road transport sector doesn't meet that pace, how realistic is it that other sectors can make up that shortfall?
Yeah, and just to be very careful, that's why I started my remarks by saying we never advocate policies and select specific technologies, because we do look very specifically at the enablers and the barriers that would allow targets to be met. And we're not naive about the difficulties that you face in terms of consumer take-up for many of these technologies. And I think it's probably the case that heat pumps is rolling out much more slowly than is the case for electric vehicles, where the attractions, are fairly obvious. So I think governments, you need to stand make up, and they need to be realistic about the pace at which they can actually operate. But that's also why I ended up my point about the importance of net zero. If you don't get to net zero, you don't stop global warming. It's not a religion, it's physics and chemistry, it's a scientific fact, which all we can do is point that out to people.
I think that's it. Professor Jim, thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Very, very nice to meet you. Thank you.